listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
How's everyone doing? Great to have you here for another episode of my show, Straight to Video. And on today, I bring you a talk with award-winning audio director, producer, and writer, Mr. Dirk Maggs. After my last episode with the wonderful David Menken, he said I should reach out to Dirk as he felt he'd be a good fit for the show, and he was not wrong. This was a pretty epic and inspiring chat, which I'm sure you're going to love listening to. Now, Dirk's career has been pretty amazing, and we try our best to cover as much of it as we had time for. We chat about growing up in Jersey and his early passions for music and in particular drumming, but we also learn of his move to the UK and in particular London, where he would begin working for the BBC, and this amazing chain of events which would echo throughout the rest of his career, from working on audio adaptations of comic book superheroes to meeting Douglas Adams and putting pieces together to bring Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy back to the radio. Then later his friendship and working relationship with Neil Gaiman, and how it took around 30 years to bring the DC Comics story The Sandman to life. All of these productions are what Dirk describes as audio movies. They capture the audio excitement of big budget films but let you create the images in your mind. It's pretty amazing to let him explain all of this, along with sharing some great stories about working on the unreleased Alien 3 script with the original cast of Aliens, right through to his wonderful friendship with Queen guitarist Brian May. There is a lot to unpack from this chat. What you could do with diving into a talk like this is grabbing some amazing rock and roll ground or full bean coffee from our friends Dead Skull Coffee, who are serving up 15% off any order from their website deadskullcoffee.co.uk. You simply add the discount code STV on checkout, and I know a bunch of you have grabbed some, and that is equally awesome for Richie and Mark, who run Dead Skull, but it's super cool for me to learn that it's this show that sent you their way, so thanks so much from all of us for your support. Okay, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this chat, as it's certainly a favourite of mine, and I hope it becomes one of yours too. If you want to learn more afterwards, then Dirk has his own website at dirkmaggs.com, and The Sandman is available to listen to now over at Audible if you want to check that out. But right now, please enjoy my straight-to-video chat with Dirk Maggs. If it's okay with you, I'd love to trace your journey a little. I realise it spans a few decades, but I love that some events in your career, one has led to another, and how some projects get started, but it takes many years before they actually come to life and get finished. So I'd love to touch on those. But going right back, are you originally from Jersey? Did you grow up there?
Yeah, I was born in Jersey in the Channel Islands. Yeah, I lived there till I was 6 years old, and it was sort of idyllic, really, because you're never more than sort of 3.5 miles away from the sea at any given point, really, on the island. So, yeah, and it was fantastic. Loved it there. But my dad, I think island culture is quite, well, it's insular by virtue of the name. And I think after a bit, he was a London boy, really.
All right, okay.
He missed, sort of stuff happening. It was all a little bit tight-knit and a little bit everybody knew everybody.
What took him out to Jersey then?
He worked in youth work, and he went to run a youth club in St Helier in the capital. Well, the capital city of Jersey. It's quite not really a capital city, but anyway, the main town in the main parish. Yeah, he used to, with his friend Don Geary, he ran the youth club there. And Don, who was my godfather, actually went on running it till the late 1980s. But Dad went out there in the 50s. And it's actually quite an interesting story, in a slightly sort of disturbing for my mother. My dad died in 1976, but in the 50s, he went there to run the youth club. And then they offered him the job of running the local home for boys, which was in this old building on the side of the island. And he took on the job. There was a home for girls and a home for boys, because Jersey had quite a problem with kids coming from abusive families or with no family for one reason or another. So the home for boys was this sort of rather Victorian-looking institution. Dad and Mum took over as superintendent and matron, and they took over from a couple who the kids absolutely hated. They were quite brutal.
And probably especially back then, in like that time.
In the 50s, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, it was kind of, spare the rod and spoil the child and all that ridiculous business. And Dad took this over. And then, long story short, when we left in 1961, it was taken over by another couple who immediately started treating the kids badly again. And the name of the place, when the Home for Girls and the Home for Boys was put together, Dad was asked, would you like to rename it? And he looked at the fact there were a lot of rabbit holes all over the property because it was overlooking Montague Castle, which is on the east coast of Jersey, quite a famous landmark. I'm starting to talk with a Jersey accent now. You're forcing me back into this because we talk in Jersey. It's almost South African. It's weird. And I've not really told this story publicly before, but Dad called it Odalagaren, which is basically high over the rabbit warren. Anyway, they left in 61, stayed in touch with a lot of the kids who they had there because they helped a lot of kids. One kid is my honorary brother. He's called Frank. And Dad got him. He was going to join the Merchant Marine. And my father, who was ex-Fleet Air Arms, says, you're not joining the Merchant Marine. You'll join the Royal Navy or nothing, lad. And he got Frank into the Royal Navy. And Frank worked as a stoker and an oiler on Navy ships through the 60s. And he was always, whenever I ring him, he says, David, your father. My first name's David. He said, David, your father, he helped me. I would have been nothing without him. And I'm saying, of course you wouldn't, Frank, of course you'd be something. But, that was the sort of effect they had. A lot of kids really thought well of them. Anyway, the place, they left in 61. The place was taken over by other people who didn't have Mum and Dad's high standards of childcare. And as a result, there was a huge, huge scandal in the 80s, 90s, zeros of kids who felt that they'd had their childhoods ruined by abuse at the Odalagaren. And it became a very big thing. And my mum, who was still alive and getting on a bit in her 80s and 90s, was terribly upset by this, not because of their reputation, because they had no case to answer. I mean, Jersey police weren't interested at all in Mum and Dad because, they were a peaceful interregnum between these people, these dreadful people. But it really hurt her that kids she knew and loved and looked after were then treated badly. So it's a funny memory, Jersey. But that said, now dragging us away from this rather sad subject and all the damaged people who are still, suffering. It was a bloody brilliant place to grow up as a kid. I mean, beaches everywhere, sunshine. We had donkeys, we had goats, for the kids to sort of, feed and look after. It was just great. So I miss island life. I would have really had a great time being a beach bum.
Do you see yourself retiring there, going back and having like a little cabin by the beach, nothing to do all day?
I wish, sadly. You have to have lived there now. I think it's 15 years to get a residential permit, and I only lived there till I was 6. So I'd be so old by the time. Yeah, so I won't be, but I do plan a visit soon because I just miss it. I miss all the memories and the lovely people.
What was your escape as a young boy? Was it the radio or TV, film, comic books, music, or all of the above?
Oh, my God. Well, I grew up in the 60s. I was born in 55. So, I was just right. The Beatles came along when I was 6, 7, 8. So the music the 60s music. And because Mum and Dad were running homes for, teenagers and kids, we had all those records. So I was listening to Buddy Holly before he was dead. Because Frankie, the lad that Dad sent off in the Navy, came back from places like New York with all these 45s.
So you had all these older brothers, in a sense, influencing you.
Yeah, it was brilliant. That's really good, Rob. Yeah, that's exactly it. So I had all that, and which meant that it was just fantastic. So I remember hearing Peggy Sue. Can only been 3 or 3.5. But of course, you don't forget that rhythm, So there was that, and then the Beatles, in the 60s and so on. So Beatles, Kinks, Stones, Who, everything.
Would this have been in Jersey then, or once you moved? Where did you move to when you came back to the UK?
No, this is once we moved to the mainland. Mum and Dad had worked in a place in Croydon and then went down to Sussex. So they worked in a couple of places. But the kids were always getting the records, So I remember when Revolver came out, and in 66, that summer, I was 11 going on 12, walking past the sort of all the bedrooms of the kids, and everybody was playing a different track from Revolver on their little Danzettes, And the thing was that, of course, then you want to be in a band because, then the Monkees came along and so on. So at school, we were going to have a band and I was going to play guitar. And then somebody gave me a guitar and I had to go on it. I thought, this is too hard. I can't be doing this.
This ain't happening.
No. So I asked Dad for a set of drums. I said, can I have a set of drums for Christmas? And he said, oh, no, grumble, grumble, grumble. Didn't hear anything about it. Anyway, went down on Christmas morning and there under a sheet, there was a drum kit, proper drum kit, missing a floor tom, but it was all there otherwise. And there were proper drums, a little bit new old stock from 1938, I think, but never mind. We'll gloss over that.
What time was this in Christmas morning? Because that could have woke the neighbours up.
It was probably about 5 a.m.,
Oh, shit.
Apparently, when he was putting up the night before, he said to Mum, he said, this will be in the attic by Easter. But it wasn't. Because I kept playing and I watched Top of the Pops to learn. I watched what the drummers were doing with it was what you were doing with the right foot that was the hard thing because you couldn't see. And of course, in those days, they weren't recording bass drums that clearly. But Ringo really helped. And so playing along to Beatles records and so on.
Was Ringo your guy?
Yeah, he really was. Because what he was doing was simple, but actually it wasn't. Now you listen to it now.
It gets a lot of respect now. It's like,
oh, God, he's good.
The identity and character in his playing.
Yeah. Band's only as good as its drummer. So I've been playing ever since. So I still play in bands now. I still have more than one kit. In fact, my favorite kit is one that comes from 1967. It's old Ludwig Super Classic. And I think it's the kit that Dad would have bought me if he'd had the money and knew what to buy. That was my present to myself. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think you've said you got to pub drummer grade, which I'm not sure is a professional qualification, but
I can drive a band and I can get a room up and dancing. And that's really all that matters. I occasionally go to a drum camp near where we live in Winchester during the year, which is brilliant. I meet lots of other drummers and it's always lovely because drummers are nice people. They're very centered and they're very there's a meditative aspect to drumming, which is underrated. People think we're animals, but actually it's the opposite. We're pretty actually balanced people. And so we all get together and do stuff. And there's all this technical stuff going down. There's Craig Blundell, who plays with people like Stephen Wilson, who comes in and gives you 18/16 time with fills that you start on the left hand and finish with your head or whatever it is. And I love the kind of mental exercise of doing that, but actually just sitting behind a band and getting that swing into the backbeat. So that is my thing. But of course, growing up in the 60s, it wasn't just the music, it was the telly. We didn't actually have a telly in Jersey till very late on. And the first thing, and then I used to watch like The Lone Ranger, which was by then a fairly ancient TV series. Cowboys were the thing in the late 50s, early 60s. But then what I really got into, I came to the mainland, as we call the UK, was Jerry Anderson.
Right.
The first thing I saw of his was Supercar, this thing called Supercar. And it was just, I was so lost in that world.
That's one that doesn't get much mention.
No, it's old, but it's great. The design of the vehicle is fantastic. I was said on Twitter the other day, I want one of these now, 61 years later. Just brilliant. And it's funny, because years later you think, oh, God, must have been rubbish, really, with puppets and so on. And then you watch it and they really did it. Thunderbirds is what people remember and maybe Stingray and possibly Fireball. But in these supercar things, they actually had a sense of humor. They were funny. The gags were good. And then there were explosions and things flying around. And they were all models. So you could make something like that at home.
Could do your own version somehow.
Yeah. I used to get like TV Comic or TV 21. We didn't have the money for toys then, really. Although there was a supercar toy for 9 and 11, which was 49.5p in modern English. And I said to Dad, could I have that for my birthday? I know it's not my birthday, but I really want it. And he got it for me. He was a bit of a soft touch, really, now I think about it. My pocket money was 6 a day, so 9 and 11 was a fair old bit of money. But if I didn't, I used to cut out the pictures in the comics and play with them, like sort of a 2D model. It was just a brilliant time to grow up and sort of come of age and all of that and the music and everything. So really, I'm a child of the 60s rather than the 80s, 90s in terms of music, because really when punk came along, I sort of switched out of it. Punk wasn't my thing because I was by then into Zeppelin, Yes, all the prog rock stuff, sort of stuff that people were turning their noses up at and said punk was a reaction against. And also funk music by then. I was really into Parliament and the Meters and Tower of Power and all of that sort of stuff, because it's all rhythmic and so on. And the punk was just so basic. I got that it was a reaction and all of that, but the actual music didn't interest me. So I sort of, rather like a Philistine that I am, I tended to sort of stick in the past. But then sometimes you're pleasantly surprised by stuff you discover. discover. So I'm on a voyage of discovery now of stuff that I lost touch with in the late 70s and onward, really.
When did audio work come onto your radar? Was that something that you got into at school? Or I believe you went to Winchester College during the 70s, but was that more of a drama route, or was that just your only pathway into that industry?
We have to differentiate because Winchester College is the public school that all the toffs go to, and rich kids and what have you, and then they end up being prime minister and people like that.
Right.
Screwing the country. Anyway, let's get off the politics. It was called King Alfred's College, and it was a teacher training college. I thought I wanted to be a drummer, and then I realized I wasn't at that level. So I thought, I could be an actor, though. And I applied to a couple of places for acting. And I thought so many people I knew who were actors were also out of work. So I thought what I need is to be able to know I have a job if I'm not acting. And I knew that if I went to teach training college, I could do drama and do teaching as a backup thing. So that was the idea. So King Alfred's College, Winchester, where this friend had gone. And they had a fully equipped theatre, and it was just brilliant. We had the interview with the head of the department, prepared a piece. So I did To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell, which is basically the ultimate chat-up poem. Because I wanted him to know that I was not a goody two-shoes and I was a bit of a lad. And that went really well. And they said, would you like to look around the theatre? I'm like, crikey, this is right up my street. And I was walking around, here's the stage and here's the lighting tower and here's the wardrobe department and our wardrobe mistress. And I'm thinking, I've died and gone to heaven. You can make things here. Because it's that thing of when you get a new place to work or you get a new bit of gear and you think, oh, what can I do with this? What can I make? Winchester is a nice little city, very studenty at that time, had more pubs per square inch than almost any pubs and shoe shops and the occasional church. That was Winchester in the 70s. And so I went to King Alfred's for 4 years because I decided to hang on and get a degree and just had the most fantastic time. I mean, I don't think I actually studied for my finals until the morning of the first exam, certainly for the education final. Terrible. I don't know how I did. I scraped through. Just terrible.
Was you playing in bands at that time?
I was playing in bands. I was doing productions. I think I was in a production of Fiddler on the Roof when we were doing our finals. It wasn't the performing aspect. It was just the creating things aspect that was so great. And then the band was doing the valedictory ball. The band was called Burgle because we stole all our material.
Good one.
Yeah. We're doing the valedictory ball, and one of the year above, a girl I'd briefly gone out with was coming back to visit just for the day. And it happened to be the day we were rehearsing in the Great Hall. And I was chatting and said, well, how's it going? In London. She said, it's great. I'm working for the BBC. I said, bloody hell, how'd you do that? And she said, well, I applied. And I'm thinking back careers teachers at school who think you'd probably work quite well as a junior estate agent. And you want to be Elvis Costello or something. And they're channeling you through these really grey and dull things. And I'd been told by one of the lecturers, I'd said to him, I fancy joining the BBC. He said, you'll never make it. It's a closed club. It's walled in. You won't get in there. And I kind of accepted it. I tend to do that. If somebody tells me something, I just take it for granted.
Well, especially mentioning the BBC, that's the highest level to everybody, especially from the outside. That's going in at the top, essentially.
Yeah, it is. But I was always kind of, well, why not? But this guy who was terribly certain about everything, because he had contacts in the business. I mean, he sort of said this, and I thought, well, okay, I guess that's it then. I can't do that. So I'm struggling to think what I'm going to do. And she says, I applied to go on a trainee studio manager course. I said, well, what's that? She said, well, you kind of operate the tapes and the grams in the studio, and then you work your way up and you can work the sound panel. And I thought, well, I know how to do tapes. I know how to put a bloody needle on a record. How hard can this be? And it's in sound, and it's a great medium. And I loved the Goon show by then. There was lots of BBC radio output, all the music, obviously, but the Goons, and then Round the Horn, which was a comedy show in the 60s that was very funny and very rude if you knew what the jokes were. And so I applied, and I went for an interview up in London, and I honestly didn't know what I was doing, Rob. I was just so winging it. So what are your interests? What do you like to watch on television? Tom and Jerry. What newspaper do you read? And I didn't read a newspaper, but I literally looked across the room and there was a folded up copy of the Daily Mail. So I said the Daily Mail. I would never read the Daily Mail in 1,000 years, but that was what I said, which was obviously the right answer. Gave me a hearing test. My hearing was A1. And couple of weeks later, dear Mr. Maggs, I'm very happy to offer you a place on the studio manager's training course starting in July the 19th, 1978.
So was it like pack your bags, move to London?
Yeah, it was exactly that. And the weird thing was, bless him, Dad had died a couple of years before. Mum was living near Bristol. And I'd pretty much stayed in Winchester as much as I could because I wasn't crazy about, I liked to be where the action was, and where she was living didn't feel very action-y. It wasn't Bristol, it was outside it. But I found a flat with my mate who'd been a student in the drama department, Graham Hoadley, who's lovely. And I've since worked with as an actor. I've been able to get him into things we've done. And we moved into a flat in Southfield, South London, and off we went.
How was London around that time? Was it exciting for you working not only for the BBC, but in this city with all these great music venues, nightlife? Was you like, this is incredible?
It was brilliant because the thing about this studio manager thing was that you kind of ended up with a bunch of very like-minded people from all over the world. Like one of the people on my course, Miti Adhikari, had come in from India, and other guys south of Scotland. I mean, it was a whole eclectic mix of people and backgrounds and so on, but we were all of a certain age, all in early 20s, and we were all very bright, and we were all really into creating stuff with the electronic media. My wife, who I might add, I met over a hot tape machine not long after I joined. She was actually senior to me. I was her second pair of hands. We laugh about that now. She says it was kind of like being given a sort of group of friends you didn't know you had, because we all got on really well. And we would go to the pub at lunchtime down the Yorkshire Grey by Broadcasting House for a lunchtime drink. And then we go back to the Langham Hotel, which then was the BBC building, was owned by the BBC, where we were trained in how to put a needle on a record, which actually turned out to be more of a skill than I realized. And editing tape with a razor blade and sticky tape and so on. And then, of course, you're in London. So, yeah. We're in the heart of the West End. There's great restaurants just over at Charlotte Street and Titchfield Street and all of that. There's gigs going on everywhere. Punk was, when the kind of new wave was coming in at that point, 78. So there were lots of bands to go and see, and also lots of musicians actually in the BBC. So I got into a couple of bands while I was there. In fact, I had to postpone my wife and I's first date for a band rehearsal. So it's kind of a poor Les, bit of a warning of what was on the way, really. It was a great time. And in terms of the actual medium I was working with, I thought I wanted to get into television. Television was what I wanted to do. But it was really funny. The BBC are very funny. They like to keep you in your place. So when we joined, when you're offered the job, they say, this is by no means a route to other BBC work. You are expected to remain a studio manager, which was absolute tosh, really, because almost everybody elsewhere in the corp, quite a lot of them started as studio manager. I mean, from Esther Ranson, she started as studio manager through to senior management. So it was in every way a kind of guaranteed way in. But of course, you had to not mess up. We had to do an exam at the end of the course, or you were out on your rear unless you begged for your life. And the other thing was, I knew I wanted to do television. I'm going to get out of radio as soon as I can, go and do television. And a couple of years later, I actually got a secondment, what they call an attachment to television, to go and work in television presentation, which was sort of doing everything, stitching together all the programs for the evening on BBC One or BBC Two, because there were only two channels at that time. And also making trailers and promotional items and stuff like that. And it was really weird. I went to Television Central and I thought, oh, this is it, television, yeah. And it was really boring. And it's so weird. This is going to sound awful because lots of revolutionary things were happening there. But from my point of view, it was very limiting, very tame. You couldn't get anything achieved without going through about 6 people first.
I was going to say, was it a lot like waiting around for somebody else to do something before you could do something?
Yes, that's it. Yeah, a lot of hurry up and wait. Yeah, and it was just to feed this monster. And the other thing was, technically, it's interesting now, we have HD TV and so on and so forth. And when you look back at old TV shows, you can see that they're technically limited. But I have to say that actually, if you were in the room with a real high-end monitor, I used to go down to VT department, which were under that fountain in the center of the donut. And if you were actually in there with one of these guys, the quality of the video was actually pretty good, but it was still technically pretty limited. And I wanted to really make films. I made them at school, sort of 8mm epics. We did a Viking epic called They Came and Went, and the punchline was about accidentally taking a laxative. But this felt terribly limited and hard work, and the cameras were the size of small trucks being wheeled around the studio floor. So it was really very interested. And I was there for about 18 months in the end. And I kept thinking, I'm going to apply to join drama. I'm going to go to drama. Interestingly, as I was walking through the corridor, you could go into observation lounges looking into the studios, and they were like shooting plays and stuff like that. And there was the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy TV series being shot. So you look in there and think, oh, that's interesting. Kind of. And you carry on because you can't really see anything from up high. Anyway, long story short, the end of the television thing, I just thought, do you know what? I'm having more fun in radio, really. The pictures are sort of better, and it's kind of like you can do anything in sound, really. You don't have to worry about whether they can build the set. You just put the right noises in.
That scratched your creative itch.
Yeah, it did in a funny kind of way. And so I came back to radio and I'm playing in bands, and Les and I wanted to get married. And so all of that was also, there. And I never missed telly at all. Didn't want to go back. And the whole film thing, I'd actually spent some time on a film set just before I went to the television attachment, because my uncle was a film producer in Toronto, and they were making a movie called Nothing Personal with Donald Sutherland in the lead. And I was there for the shoot, and everybody hated each other so much. It was really funny. I mean, there was interesting stuff like Donald Sutherland, when I had any direct dealings with him, was charming. But in terms of the pecking order in the production area and so on, and my uncle wasn't being spoken to by the director.
Right.
So I was there kind of on sufferance. One of my most useless technical skills is I can load a Panavision magazine for a Panavision movie camera, which I never use now. But if anyone wants to send me back through time to a crisis camera magazine, I can.
You've got it covered.
Yeah. And I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And it was, in the end, we'd had our first Tom in 86, and we were walking up and down the Chilbolton Avenue in Winchester talking about what to do. And I joined BBC Radio 2 Press to make trailers, and we'd had some fun making kind of trailers. We would have all the regular things to do, like that Ken Bruce had done one. So Ken would have voiced it, add a bit of music under, put that out. Or there'd be one for The Organist Entertains, or, all those lovely old Radio 2 programs for very niche groups of people. Paul Jones, The Rhythm and Blues Show, all excellent stuff for their audiences and so on. But they were very easy to do. So we'd get them all out the way. We had like 6 to do a day, I worked out. And then 4 of those would be standard fare. And then we'd have 2 to play with. And so we've got a radio studio. You've got good voice talent, because all the Radio 2 announcers are about, and we've got all afternoon to have a bit of fun. So that's when we used to do these big campaigns, like where they would do the license fee, television license fee, which is what pays for the BBC still at the moment, encouraging people to pay it or to go on some kind of credit plan. And so we could do anything. So for the license fee thing, I came up with an idea, and this is long before the film was made, of the 1 minute Lord of the Rings. We do the whole of the Lord of the Rings in a minute and sell the license fee. So we did that. And that was a bit mad. Me and Steve Madden and a bunch of library music.
Because you go on to work on audio adaptations of like superhero stuff.
Yeah, that was the thing. And sorry, I'm slowing up. But that's kind of where it came from, because also one of the campaigns was called Crime Check, which was to encourage people to help their neighborhood watch thing. And I thought, we could do lots of old characters like Sherlock Holmes and Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot and what have you. And so I thought, we could do Batman. Batman's a detective. Let's do him. And so I thought, I better ring and get permission. So I rang DC Comics in New York, which was like, you just didn't do that.
No.
You don't ring New York, not in 1988 or 86. And I said, can I use Batman for a thing? And they said, what are you intending to do? I said, I don't know, Batman and Robin in the Batcave talking about how good the Crime Check campaign is. And the lady at the other end, who was called Phyllis Hume, and there's a reason I say her name, said, okay, well, look, one of my colleagues is coming over on her way to the Bologna Book Fair, and she's stopping over in London. If she can come in and listen to it, if she approves it, you can use it.
Wow. That's sign of the times with all the red tape, which I would imagine goes through nowadays.
Well, yeah, no, this was it. Thank God. Chantal was the lady's name, Chantal Dolnice. And she came into Broadcasting House, got her from reception, brought her up to the back, played it to her. She said, this is fun. That's good. Yeah, you can do that. And we just done like an Adam West rip-off thing. And then she said, did you know that next year is Superman's 50th birthday? And I said, no. And she said, well, in case you want to do anything with that. At the time, I sort of thought, wow. Yeah, I would be lucky to get another campaign like this to do it on. And she went off, didn't think about it. Anyway, at that time, Leslie and I were talking about what I was going to do. And I said, what I'd really like to do, because I love the Goon shows, I love Round the Horn, I love listening to stuff like Radioactive, and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by then had been out, the first radio series. And I said, I quite fancy working in Radio Light Entertainment. And so happened a vacancy came up, and this is the BBC comedy department, radio comedy department. And they wanted program ideas. And then you had to go in and pitch the program ideas as part of your interview process. And so I pitched the idea of a 50th birthday tribute to Superman, which was like a documentary drama with dramatized bits of Superman comics. I never thought in a million years I'd either get the job or they'd go for it. But I went and did the interview and I got the damn job. And Superman on Trial, which is what it turned into, got commissioned. And yeah, it was absolutely amazing to me. And that started everything else that happened, Rob, came from that one phone call when I asked permission to do something. So when people say, oh, don't ask permission, ask forgiveness, do it and then ask forgiveness. That's true quite a lot of the time, but sometimes it doesn't do any harm to reach out. But what was interesting, I'll jump through the next bit, but I always find the setting up of things more interesting. But just to say that it was Superman on Trial. Then we did a Batman one for the 50th birthday of Batman, which was kind of like the following year. And that had Michael Gough in it. And the Superman one was fun because we put Superman on trial and the witnesses could be fictional or real. That meant that Adam West came into Broadcasting House to publicize the new repeats of Batman. And I literally heard that day he was in, and I was preparing Superman on Trial. And I ran down to reception where he'd arrived with his minders and I said, Mr. West, would you have 5 minutes to come into a studio when you finished your interview with Gloria Hunniford or whoever he was seeing, just to be a witness on Superman's behalf in the trial of Superman? So of course I will. Of course I will. Happy to do. So he came in. So I went away, wrote the questions. By the time he came out of Gloria, and of course the great thing is, having worked for Radio 2 trailers, I knew I could just nip in and grab it and Gloria wouldn't mind. Took him upstairs, asked him the questions, and then in the actual program, the defense attorney for Superman is Lois Lane and the prosecution counsel is Lex Luthor. So Lex is asking all these questions of Adam West.
Super. It's super like universe crossovers meta thing way before it became trendy to do that.
It was such fun. And he was great. And I let him answer it. I didn't write his answers. I said, how would you feel if there was no Superman to defend the Earth? And he said, I'd feel shattered, torpedoed, riven.
Just off the cuff like that.
That's just off the top of his head.
How was it for you to create these audio stories, I guess, of characters you had essentially grown up with? Because this would be before the blockbuster movies we get today. I guess we'd had the Superman films with Christopher Reeve, but other than that, it was just the odd TV shows for the most part. So what was your reference on how you wanted these superheroes to be perceived?
That's a very good question, Rob. And it was very much along the lines of how Richard Donner did the first Superman movie, where you take it absolutely seriously. You treat it as if it's real and you don't joke around with it, even though I loved Adam West as Batman, who wouldn't? But the way that first movie was done, where Donner and Christopher Reeve were absolutely sincere about it, that's what I wanted to do. That was key to everything for me. Make it believable and make the acting real. And I wasn't that experienced directing actors at that time, but it actually taught me a lot to work with American actors. Bill Hootkins, who played Lex Luthor, he was Porkins in Star Wars.
Oh, yeah.
In the Trench Run, and he was in Raiders of the Lost Ark. We need top men, Dr. Jones. And Bill was great because he said once in the studio, he wasn't getting clearly told what he needed. And he threw the script down. He said, we're actors. Tell us what you want us to do and we'll do it. And it was like, oh, okay. Simple as that, and really vocalized. And when you work with people who've kind of worked with people like Spielberg, who are that good, generally speaking, the top professionals don't come in with an ego. They come in wanting to do the gig. And it's been the same ever since. It's the same of Hootkins then. It's the same working with James McAvoy, Michael Sheen, John Lithgow now. They're not in there to be a celebrity. They're there to help you create something. And what was interesting about this, now looking down the other end of the telescope from where we are now, when I'm doing Sandman with Neil Gaiman, everything that came from that tiny phone call, when I said to you that was a tiny phone call to this lady, Phyllis, the thing is, it's Phyllis Hume who said to me about a year later or so, have you heard of a guy called Neil Gaiman? Ever met a guy called Neil Gaiman? And I said, no. We are a small country, but not that small. We don't all know each other.
Everyone thinks you're from London.
Yeah, that's it. Bless her. And she says, you've got to read what this guy's writing. And this was the great thing about working with DC back in the day, is that you get great big FedEx boxes through the post with tons of comics in. And so she sent me Sandman up to that point. This is about 1991. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, holy, because I made friends with Dave Gibbons. I got him in to come and be a witness for Superman. So I knew his and Alan's work with Watchmen, Alan's stuff with V for Vendetta and Swamp Thing, all of that stuff. But I hadn't heard of Neil. I don't know why, but I hadn't. And then I was reading this thing, I'm thinking, holy shit, this is good. This guy is scarily creative. And that was the one thing that happened, that this sort of tenuous connection with Neil. And this was in the very early days of like email. And she gave me Neil's email and I sent him a kind of, look, you don't know me, but we have a mutual friend. And I don't know what my first email said, but at some point early on in the conversation, I said to him, look, if I could ever make or get the BBC to consider an idea of a Sandman series, would that be a problem for you? He said, well, he said, it obviously belongs to DC Comics. It certainly wouldn't be a problem for me. I'd love it. And this was like 30 years ago that we had the first conversation about what we're only finally doing in the last 2 or 3 years. So there was that. And the other thing was, off the back of the Supermans, was that then the controller Radio 4 said, have you got anything else? And I said, what would you like? He said, well, how about some more Superman? And I'm thinking, what? And I said, well, like the Adventures of Superman. He said, yeah, can you do it for me? 15-minute episodes, 5 at a time, a series of 5. God, yeah. So I'm ringing Phyllis and again telling her this, and we make it. And then my boss in Light Entertainment rings me and says, Dirk, have you got 5 minutes? He says, look, I've just had a phone call from Douglas Adams. And he's heard your Superman work, and he thinks that you might be the guy to bring the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy back home to radio, because Jeffrey Perkins had moved on to television by that time, and Douglas had written 3 books that didn't start as radio series.
That TV show, you'd poke your head in to see what was going off.
Yeah, that was on the parallel set of rails, but hit the buffers, if I can extend the metaphor to snap. And that was Douglas hearing the Superman thinking, actually, this guy knows what he's doing with noises. He could be someone to work with. And the weird thing, here's the weird part of the triangle here, is that Neil actually was also strangely mentored by Douglas, because Douglas knew Neil when Neil was a journalist. Neil went and interviewed Douglas and then wrote a book called Don't Panic about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy up to that point in 1986. So here we are, Neil and I both kind of mentored by Douglas, starting this long 30-year journey.
Unreal.
Yeah, so strange. And only in the last 10 years have we actually worked together properly.
Yeah. From like the comic books, you went on to do Spider-Man, but a previous guest on this show, Tim Quinn, I think he introduced you to Brian May. He's an incredible journey. He has. Some of his strange things, like just moving to somewhere and getting a job opportunity somewhere. It's unreal.
I love Tim. He's a complete one-off. He's also the best tour guide to Liverpool you could ever get, by the way. If you love the Beatles and Liverpool, get Tim to show you around. Tim Quinn, who suggested we do Spider-Man when we were doing all this DC Comics stuff on BBC Radio 1, said, oh, do you know what would be great? Get music by Brian May. I'll go and find out if he wants to do it. And I thought, what?
Just somebody with the name Brian May, not the Queen Brian May. It must be a different one.
Yeah. I know. But he got Bri. He said, I think Brian May's into comics. Anyway, Bri is into comics. So we all met at Brian's. I drove up to Brian's and I said to Leslie, my wife, I said, I know what there's going to be there. There's going to be at least one pinball machine and the Queen drum kit. And I was sort of joking. And I went to Brian's place and I walked in and there was 2 pinball machines and the Queen drum kit, because they were recording the posthumous album, the Freddie album, the Made in Heaven album. And then Roger's kit was up because they were doing some track laying on it. Anyway, it was the weirdest thing, but we just got really on really well. It was like meeting an old schoolmate. It's just, it just worked. And we've been in touch ever since. It's lovely. I mean, we email once every 2 or 3 months about stuff, and we have common interests, and we have 1 or 2 projects that we still nurse hopes of doing, which are nothing to do with music or superheroes, sort of more documentary stuff. But Brian, as you know, is an astrophysicist. And there was a time when we did the Independence Day UK, we had Patrick Moore as the guest expert in it, the astronomer, Patrick Moore, who was really eccentric. I'd met him when he did panel games for me when I was a comedy producer. Anyway, I said to Brian, have you ever met Patrick Moore? He said, oh, I met him when I was a student at UCL, but he didn't know me from Adam. I said, well, would you like to meet him again? Because you might be up for a get-together. So I rang Patrick and I said, Patrick, have you heard of a chap called Brian May? He said, no, don't know him. And I said, he's a guitarist in a pop group called Queen. No, don't know them. So I said, well, look, he'd love to meet you. Oh, bring him down, dear boy, bring him down. More the merrier. Because Patrick was just like that. So we went down to Farthing's, Patrick's house. And Patrick was there in the doorway and he was all dressed nice. in a sort of red blazer, holding his arms out, saying, "Welcome, welcome, welcome. Before we have a drink, let me show you Saturn." And he'd set up his 15-inch refractor in the garden, pointed at Saturn. Now, if you've ever pointed a telescope, I'd never actually looked through a telescope at that point. So it's Saturn. It's really there. It's there right now with the rings and everything. And I'm thinking, he's pulling out all the stops. I think he's looked up and realized who Brian is. But Brian is lovely and never assumes anything. So Brian was being, "Oh, yeah, right. Okay, yeah. God, yeah, Saturn, great." Actually, I think it was pointed at stars. Forgive me. He said, "Come and look at some stars," because it was pointed up. And Patrick said, "Any requests?" And Brian said, "Yeah, how about Saturn?" And that was right, because Patrick starts sort of going, "No," because the planets are sort of on a plane that is quite a bit lower than the stars that are right overhead. So he had to lower this huge telescope. It's a bit like sort of one of those anti-aircraft guns. You have to do this sort of double thing with your hands. So and it goes down and then finally gets Saturn. And we saw Saturn and it was amazing and so on. And I actually took a couple of photos in there. I shouldn't, because the flash went off, ruining everybody's night vision. And I can't find them. I think I gave them to Patrick. Anyway, and we had this wonderful evening, and it was clear Patrick had done his research. But the sweet thing was that Brian had brought a load of Queen albums and his solo album along to give to Patrick as a sort of present. But he brought them on vinyl because he didn't think Patrick would be advanced enough for a CD. It was so sweet. So we were sat there, it's like 1 a.m, and Patrick said, "Hi, love you to listen to some of my music." He writes brass band music. So we're all sitting in his study and there's his xylophone with "Do not put drinks on the xylophone" on it, listening to Patrick's brass band music off a little tinny cassette.
Oh, nodding along.
Yeah, with Bright, one of the world's top rock guitarists, listening to rum, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. And it was so sweet and lovely. And what did happen off that was fantastic, is that Patrick and Brian then started corresponding, and Brian went back to finish his degree, his doctorate, his PhD, because Patrick made him. Patrick made him go and dig it out and do it. And that was great, which was fantastic. So in 2007, we had a big party at Farthing's, a science party, at which Patrick turned up dressed as Dumbledore. I loved that. That was great. He wasn't going to have any of this nonsense. And Brian got his doctorate. But then also Patrick was terrible with his money and he didn't look after it. And the house was going into disrepair and he couldn't afford it. Brian basically bought the house in sections from under him so that Patrick could live in it, so that Patrick would never have to move out for as long as he lived.
Oh, amazing.
That is a top human being.
What a guy.
Yeah, top human being.
Oh, what a fantastic story. So many elements to that. That's brilliant.
Mad, isn't it? Yeah.
Unreal. So good.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us. That's brilliant.
I'm sure Brian won't mind. I'm very careful the stories I tell because some of them are sort of private, but that was, I think it's common knowledge now that Brian did that. So I'm glad to have been a small part of that.
Oh, nice one. Has there been a point in your career where you feel you hit on your style? You make what you call audio movies, but you've seen so many changes in the industry which have allowed you to grow, I guess, to develop this. We've had the transition from tape to digital. And I've read you would go and see films like Terminator 2 and you wanted to take that sound.
Popcorn lunch break.
Yeah. Has there been something that's really allowed you to create that ideal scenario?
Very good. I've got to say, you asked the right questions, Rob, because that's absolutely true. No, it's very perspicacious because there were critical points. I mean, digital technology came not a moment too soon for me into audio business because Douglas and I were talking about doing a third series of Hitchhikers in 1992, even though I didn't end up making them for another 12 years because of copyright problems. But Douglas and I were talking at that time about it. And I'd already started working a bit with surround sound, or had the idea of doing surround sound, and he was all for it. And that meant we had to go into digital technology because doing surround in an analog way is a nightmare. Jonathan Ruffle, who did Len Dayton's Bomber in surround using tape machines. And I think he wore his legs down to bloody stumps running from tape machine to tape machine to try and do it. But digital technology, absolutely. But the moment I hit my style, I remember it really well. I was doing The Adventures of Superman and we were recording it with 3 tape machines. So that's 3 stereo channels and 2 gram decks. That's 2 additional stereo sources plus the actors. So I recorded the actors dry and then I'd add the sound effects and the backgrounds and the street noise and the bangs and crashes, and then find some library music, which is like not commercially available in HMV, but sounds really good, sort of dramatic music, or can sound really bloody awful too. But anyway, that's another story. I was doing overnights in channel H50A in Broadcasting House at 3 a.m. because the studio managers who did the drama were great. But what I wanted to achieve was something that they would make sound like a radio drama. And I wanted it to sound like a film soundtrack. And I was going out at lunchtime watching movies like Terminator 2 or Thelma and Louise. That era, it was any film, just had these really great sort of the Foley, the body effects, the footsteps, the handling of objects. All of this was so crystal clear and fantastic.
Was you sat in the cinema with your eyes closed at any point?
No. I was watching the film, bro. That'd be daft. If you work with audio for any length of time, you begin to listen critically, in the nicest sense, to anything you hear. And you think, oh, that's a bit toppy, or that's a bit woofly. And I'm sitting, it's 3 a.m. I've got these 3 tape machines, 2 gram decks, and I'm trying to do this battle between Bizarro and Superman on the streets of Metropolis. And it's spinning in stuff. And I'm going through generations of tape. It's like Queen with Bohemian Rhapsody. Eventually, the master tape is wearing bloody thin. And I stopped at about 3 a.m. and went down to the canteen and got a cup of coffee. And I came back and I thought, what on earth am I doing? This is such a rod for my own back. This is so labor intensive. I'm having to concentrate so bloody hard to make the sounds I'm hearing match up with the picture in my head. And I just thought, yeah, but it sounds really good. It does sound good. This sounds different. I haven't heard it like this before. I'm going to have to keep going. And I did keep going. And I eventually I think I got the 7 o'clock train home from Waterloo the next morning. But I had in my backpack a 10-inch reel of that episode of Superman, thinking, yeah, this rocks. This actually really rocks. And from then on, that was my holy grail. How can I make this sound so visual you don't need pictures? It was both exciting and utterly miserable because it was so labor intensive.
I know how much work I've got to put in to get this.
Yeah.
It's going to be worth it, but shit.
Yeah.
It's going to be a slog.
Jeez, what have I done? And it's never changed. It's never changed because even now on Sandman, I have such black days. And I did the sound design on the whole of Act 1 because I wanted to write the Bible on how it should be done. And then Act 2 and Act 3, which is coming later this year, we've got a sound design team who are great and who really get it. But I had to do it to show how I wanted it. And even then, at the end, I kind of do a last mix and I do the music edit with Jim Hannigan's music because Jim is a really top composer and it's got to be so. But from 8 a.m. till 7 p.m, I'm in here with cans on in the office studio working. And when you end that day and you've been imagining visually just using your ears, your brain is literally running out of your ears and you can't actually tell what you've got. You have to give it a couple of days before you listen back to get any kind of objectivity to it at all. So it's never been easy, but I've got to say, what's really great about it, Rob, is that Radio 1 ran The Adventures of Superman. What did we say? Batman Nightfall we did Spider-Man, we did Judge Dredd, we did Superman, and then we were doing stuff like a spin-off from Independence Day, the movie where we did Independence Day UK.
What was the Alien 3 thing you did? Because that's intrigued me.
That came later. Well, that was interesting because we did all those, then Radio 1 stopped doing them. It was a bit of a fallow period and I was doing all sorts of other stuff, lots of comedy stuff. Then Audible, Steve Carsey, who was working at Audible Productions in those days, said, we've got the rights to Alien books. Would you come and do them? And by then I was actually working with Neil Gaiman. So I'd got a good relationship with Neil. We were making stuff with a lovely lady called Heather Lama for BBC. But I was looking for something to do. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy stage tour we did had collapsed rather unfortunately. And I needed a job. And Steve said, we have this Alien books to do. So we did 3 Alien books that Titan Books published, which were spin-off stories, one by Tim Levin, one by Chris Golden, one by James A. Moore. And then the 4th job, he said, there's an unmade script for Alien 3. And it's not the Fincher movie. It's written by William Gibson, the Neuromancer guy. And it's a completely different story to what they told. It's one of the early kind of versions they thought they might do. Long story short, we recorded a sequel to Aliens, which had Hicks, played by Michael Biehn, and Bishop, played by Lance Henriksen, surviving.
Kind of like the film we all wanted to see.
Yeah, it was. And it was great because I went to LA and had Michael and Lance in the studio. And of course, you hear all the war stories about making Aliens. and how pissed off Michael was that they killed him off for the new movie.
How was Michael to work with? Because I've met him at conventions, he's been super lovely. I've seen him do talks, but then you see other times people say, oh, he's really off with me.
No. And Michael doesn't suffer fools gladly. I think that's what it is. And, you know, I mean, he's had a hard time of it sometimes, and it takes its toll. But as soon as he stepped back in Hicks's fatigues, he was Hicks.
Amazing.
And Lance was wonderful because in order to tell the story, I thought we should quickly give a potted history of aliens. So I recreated the last act of Aliens in sound, which was really a challenge to rebuild the fight between the alien queen and the power loader and stuff like that. And because Sigourney Weaver had not been available for our first Alien production, I got Laurel Lefkowen, who's a brilliant American actress living in Britain, whose voice, if you shift it down by a semitone, is Sigourney's. Her accent is. So Laurel playing Ripley in the power loader against the alien queen. And I've got to say, it's one of the proudest things I've done because it's like a high definition version of the soundtrack of Aliens.
Where can that be listened to?
That's on Audible. Alien 3, and the 3 is the Roman numeral 3 upright lines rather than the figure 3. So in the end, it's great because we're making stuff that's visual with no pictures at all. And I think this is the thing really that sums it all up, Rob, is that Audible, who've been brilliant because they had the pockets deep enough to make Sandman, where the BBC really wouldn't have. We would have done it with a kind of radio drama company, which would have been fine. But I love working with James McAvoy because it's fun. We have fun in the studio and he gives it the energy and so on. And of course, he brings an audience with him. And then we have this thing. And here we are in the middle of Los Angeles on a billboard selling a purely audio product.
It's almost good that the BBC passed on it all those years ago when you approached them.
Yeah, it is. As Neil says, it had to come of age. We had to learn enough to do it well, which we have done.
We've mentioned some of the amazing people you get to work with and to provide voices to these stories, like the huge Hollywood names. How great is it to be in the studio with these people? And are they different kinds of actors, people who just have these amazing speaking voices which you recognise, but then those who transform themselves? You have someone, for example, Michael Sheen, who has this voice which you just know and love, and then someone like Andy Serkis who transforms his voice with every role. Do you like that aspect of it?
Oh, God, yeah. And Michael and Andy are both chameleons. They come in and you don't know what you're going to get. And because we've based our version of Sandman very much on the original comics, we're absolutely rigidly adhering to it. And that was a conscious decision because the Netflix series that's coming have taken, if you like, liberties. They've changed gender for characters. They've racially mixed it up. They've done all this stuff, which is great. And it's good because it breathes new life. But what I wanted to do, very conscious decision, we're going to do classic Sandman as you know it from the comics. And one of the things in the comics was that Lucifer is David Bowie, basically. It's a version of Bowie. And Michael came in and just did David Bowie. He said, well, it looks like David Bowie, so I'm going to do David Bowie. And it was just like putting on a coat, and that was it. It was David Bowie in the room.
Superb.
And Andy Serkis, who is such a top bloke. I mean, I cannot tell you.
A lot of the times there's reasons why these people are staying at the top of the game. And it's usually because they're really nice people.
They're really nice people. They're really good at what they do. And they're really nice to have around. And Andy comes in and we agreed that this was our one time in the year where we just had a laugh. And he's playing Matthew the Raven. And he's in the studio and he's actually waving his arms about while he's being Matthew to kind of get in character. It's just great. And, you know, Kevin Smith, who of all the people to be in a radio thing, Kevin Smith, we were doing a panel with him off the first series. And I said to Neil, this guy is perfect for Merv Pumpkinhead. He'd be great. And so we asked him and he said, yeah. And then he came in and he added gags. I don't mean came in with gags written down. He came in and as we did the lines, he was finding new ways to throw stuff in there, which was totally in keeping with this character. And it was just, a magic thing. Or Samantha Morton, who plays a character called Element Girl in the first series. It was a very, very sad episode where she's been living with a horrible thing and she wants it all to be over. And it's a very tricky subject. And we had to go at the acting of it very carefully because she wants to be dead. It's a tricky subject. But we turned all the lights off in the studio and just had this one little reading light on her script. I've got a photo of her actually doing it. And that helped us get it. What actors love about it is they don't have to get any makeup. They don't have to do wardrobe. They don't have to all that shit. Don't have to hit any marks. If they can hit the punctuation, that's all really I ask for. And the rest is a kind of collaborative act. But they can come in and we do stuff as much as we can, linear form from A to Z. So we begin in chapter 1 and we end in chapter whatever.
Okay, so there's not that weird juxtaposition like they say in a lot of films. You're starting halfway through the film.
Yeah, if I can avoid it, which means that they are getting to tell the story, which is great. So some of the best sessions we've had, I said to Neil, we should sell tickets to this because in a morning we do one story and we've gone from the beginning to the very end.
Exactly. And I guess it helps because they've got that emotion from previous scenes where they're going along the journey as well, I suppose.
Oh, God, yeah. Some of them particularly. And some of them, like we did the Midsummer Night's Dream, the last episode of Act One, where we actually probably did about a third of the actual Shakespeare play in order for me to get all the background going on, play going on, action that I needed for the backstage stuff going on. And so I've got actors like Ray Porter, who played Darkseid in Zack Snyder's Justice League, the big villain. Ray's actually a classically trained actor. You'll see him as Darkseid or in Sons of Anarchy as a biker beating people up. And he's now being Oberon, King of the Fairies, Richard Burbage playing Oberon. These are actors who don't get to do this shit.
Yeah.
And between Neil and the medium, here we are able to give them this sandbox to play in for an afternoon. And it's just magic. It's a joy to do. And I don't think I would have had this much fun working in television or film because the pressure is too great and there are too many people telling you what to do. I look at certain TV projects being made and think, I'm so glad I'm not a part of that, because the freedom to try stuff out in our audio medium is so enormous. And I always go back to the Beatles, really, making Sgt. Pepper. If you ever visit Abbey Road 2, it's a pretty grim-looking room with a long flight of steps up to the control room. Parquet floor, they've got 1950s equivalent of duvets taped to the walls.
But they don't touch anything because the Beatles recorded it.
It's holy. It's holy. But it's actually a dump.
Don't chuck anything out. People be diving in the skips, getting it out.
Oh, my God. It'll be, it is really like that. And yet the Beatles created, I mean, not just, but let's say Sgt. Pepper in there. All that Technicolor magic, that world creation, just four blokes, bunch of instruments in this really rather grim old room are making this magic. And that's what I love about our medium. It's that we can do that and it's all in the mind. It's all in the mind.
Dirk, I'll let you go, sir, but thank you ever so much. Lovely to speak to you.
You too, Rob. Thank you. Cheers.
Massive thank you to Dirk Maggs for such a fun and entertaining talk right here on the Straight to Video podcast. There's so much more that he's done during his career, and I urge you to dive in a little more over at dirkmaggs.com. And hopefully at some point later down the line I can maybe get him back on to share some more amazing stories, as I'm pretty sure there's lots more there. As we cruise towards 200 episodes of this podcast, you can find them all over at stvpod.com, and we also have a Patreon page which I'll be bringing some fun new content to really soon, which won't be found anywhere else. So if you enjoy this show and want to support that little bit extra, please visit patreon.com/stvpod, and I'd love to see you as part of the lovely community of great people that are already there. That is all for this episode, and I hope you've had a great time. Please tell your friends and anyone you think would enjoy this show. If all of you just tell one person, this tiny show can really grow, and it would mean a lot. But until we chat again, please take care and speak real soon.